Welcome to Public Forum, a community outreach program produced at North Idaho College on the shores of Lake Coeur d'Alene. Featuring guests from around the globe addressing a wide variety of subjects, Public Forum serves to educate and enlighten. Please join host and moderator, political scientist Tony Stewart, in welcoming today's guest.
We are so pleased to bring you a 2-week series. We like doing that because 30 minutes goes so rapidly. And we're going to do a wonderful story that we've never had the opportunity to do before. There's this remarkable historical site in Kootenai County. It's the Clark House Mansion, and it has a great history of how it came about, and it's also a great place today to go to enjoy a wonderful evening or overnight. And we're so pleased to welcome to the program Monty Daner, who is the owner of the Clark House Mansion, and welcome to our program. And it's so kind of you to be with us for 2 weeks so we can tell this great historical story.
Thank you, Tony. It's a pleasure to be here.
I'm so pleased to have our two regular panelists. First of all, Janelle Burke, who's an attorney in the state of Idaho, and next to her is Erna Reinhardt, who is Director of Public Relations at North Idaho College, and I shall invite Janelle to commence today's questioning.
It's a pleasure to have you here and talk about this fascinating house. I visited the house, and it is indeed a fascinating place. But in order for a person to have built such a grand house, the owner must have had some financial backing. He must have had many financial interests. So what was Mr. Clark's business?
Mr. Clark was born in Bangor, Maine. His father was a very wealthy merchant. Mr. Clark grew up with the proverbial gold spoon in his mouth. There was no expenses shared for his education or for his upbringing. When he graduated from Harvard University, his father was somewhat aware of opportunities here in the Northwest, and this was when Washington was still a territory. He sent Lewis to Spokane, Washington, and there he became involved in businesses. He later went on to be involved in the railroads, flour mills, and eventually got involved in 22 producing silver mines in the Coeur d'Alenes and in British Columbia. And the vast majority of his wealth was made in the mines, the silver mines. Mr. Clark also at one time owned 60 buildings in downtown Spokane. He had been the receiver for the First National Bank and acquired many of the properties in downtown Spokane. His office building still stands today. It's called the Great Western Building, and it's on Main Street at the corner of Main and Lincoln in Spokane. It's a fabulous building.
Erna Reinhardt.
So what was the nature of his business in Spokane? He owned several properties, but what did he do for a living?
Obviously, he was very well invested. He bought and sold a lot of property. In the early years, he was involved in trying to acquire property around the entire perimeter of Spokane before the railroads came. Indeed, he did. And as the railroads came to Spokane, they needed to purchase property from him in order to bring the railroads into Spokane. Hilliard Town Site is an area of Spokane where even today there's a lot of railroad activity. Mr. Clark actually owned the Hilliard Town Site Corporation, and most of that property was his. So the railroads were very influential in his ability to earn money. The flour, he built a flour mill. It was called the C&C Flour Mill. It's right on the banks of the Spokane River, and where the beautiful restaurant Clinker Daggers is today, it was originally the Clark and Curtis sawmill, or flour mill, and they used the water to generate power to operate the mill. I have an original letter that Mr. Clark wrote to his father, and he said, "Mr. Frederick Post has a property on the banks of the Spokane River, and he wants to sell it. I believe the cost was $20,000. He said, if Spokane ever becomes a successful city of perhaps 20,000 or more, it could be of good value. But at the present time, the way the water falls, the only value I could see is perhaps it could generate some power." We know now, of course, that he did go on to buy the property from Mr. Post and constructed the C&C flour mill. So that was a means of his making income. And through the later years, he got involved in the mines. He was in the Tiger Portman and the Sunshine Mine, and very heavily involved with some of the other very famous miners in the area, but made a fortune in the mines here in this area.
Wow. But Mr. Clark decided to live in beautiful North Idaho, and that's why we're here today, is to talk about the house he built on the Hayden Lake, the one that you now own. give us the story of how that came about, and a little bit of description of its size, and it was in poor shape for a while after he disappeared, but now it's back to its great beauty. But anyway, tell us about his home.
This is a fascinating story. Of course, Mr. Clark was very familiar with Idaho. He had several mines operating out of Kellogg and this entire area. He was involved, of course, with the Bazanta Tavern. Frederick Law's Olmsted actually did the grounds for the Bazanta Tavern as well as the parks for Spokane. And Mr. Clark had them out here and looking at very fine properties in the Hayden Lake area. He had decided that he loved this area and would at some point like to buy his home. In 1907, Winifred and Lewis was very wealthy by this time. They had one child, and the child had gone back to be with his grandfather on the East Coast for his education, and Winifred and Lewis started traveling around the world.
That was his wife, his spouse.
His wife was Winifred, yes. And during their travels, they of course had a magnificent yacht that they traveled all over the world in, and they associated with royalty and made several friends throughout Europe. In 1907, they decided to sail their racing fleet. They had a fleet of 3 racing ships, and take their personal yacht and go to Europe and participate in the summer regattas. The United States government heard that they were going to be sailing in the regattas, and the Admiral of the Navy approached Mr. Clark and asked him if he would be the official representative to the United States in the European regattas that year. Of course, Mr. Clark accepted. However, their little yacht would no longer do. He chartered a steamship for 3 months, invited everyone that he knew from the West Coast and the East Coast to be his guest, and they went for 3 months sailing throughout Europe. Of course, we competed against England and France and Prussia and Italy, and we took the first place honors throughout Europe. The last race was against Kaiser Wilhelm of Germany, and that had been, for many, many years, the big race, and the Kaiser had the finest fleet in the world, and he'd won the race for many, many years. But I think the Kaiser was probably a little concerned because here are the Americans on the scene now, and they're taking first place honors. And as we get closer and closer to Kiel at the north of Germany for the big race, the Kaiser decides he must be very gracious. Indeed he was. As they sailed into the Kiel harbor, the Kaiser was there, and of course they had all of the fanfare and the military and the wonderful decorated ships to greet the Clarks. The Kaiser welcomed them to Germany, and the following day they sailed the race. It was a magnificent scene. It was written in a book by Winifred, and she described the scene. It was a beautiful day on the bay at Kiel, and the military from all the different countries that had participated were present in their dress uniforms. Ships had come in from all over the world. J.P. Getty had actually docked their yacht next to the Clark's yacht. And Mrs. Clark decided to take a rain check on her shopping that day and wait for an invitation to tea, which never came, which ruffled her feathers a bit. But the next day it was a glorious, glorious race. Our three ships, the Whistlebach, the Marblehead, and the Spokane, took the lead. And as they rounded the first quarter of the trip, they were still in the lead. Spokane first, Whistlebach second, and Marblehead third. At the halfway point, they were in the lead. At the three-quarter point, they were in the lead, and then the German ship started to overcome them. And they passed the Whistlebach, and they passed the Marblehead, and we got down to the photo finish, and they beat the Spokane, and we lost the race to the Kaiser. The Kaiser said, in honor of the Americans participating for the first time, we'll hold another race tomorrow, and we'll give them another chance to beat us.
We're almost halfway through the program already, and so I know this has a connection to the Kaiser, one of the houses and mansions, but we need to do that, and so we can show on this particular program the Clark house that he built.
Okay. After the races were over, the Kaiser invited him to his summer home in the south of Germany. It's called Inselmeinau. It was his aunt's home. However, he spent his vacations there, and the Clarks stayed there with him for 4 days. I recently had the opportunity to go to Germany and visit Mainau. It's a magnificent home, 60 acres, beautiful gardens. The Clarks came home, came back to Hayden Lake, purchased 1,400 acres on Hayden Lake. The corner post was at Honeysuckle and Prairie. And it went all the way to the grounds adjoining the Hayden Lake Country Club, to the Clark House, and for 2 miles past the Clark House. The entire south side of the lake belonged to the Clark family. And there he built the magnificent 15,000 square foot mansion.
15,000 square foot.
15,000.
How many rooms does it have?
It has about 16 rooms. There were only 2 guest bedrooms in the house, a big dormitory for their son, and 9 staff bedrooms. Of course, Mr. and Mrs. Clark's suites.
Now, after living there for a number of years and all, Mr. Clark disappeared, and we have some headlines we're going to show. Would you tell the story? And to this day, it's one of the mysteries. That's what will make it a movie someday, I'm sure. But tell us about the disappearance of Mr. Clark, and I'll ask our staff to put up the headlines from the Spokesman Review that covered that when that happened.
Great. They completed the house in 1910. It was the largest and most expensive home in all of Idaho. And in the winter, they would go to Southern California and spend their winters in Santa Barbara. In 1914, 3 years after the house was completed, they were finishing up their winter visit to Santa Barbara. Winifred took the train. She had a personal train car. She took the train to San Francisco to do some shopping, and Louis was going to go on to San Diego to see a doctor. He kissed her goodnight, saw her onto the train, made sure that she was safe, walked back to his limousine, dismissed his chauffeur and his valet, and said that he wanted to walk back to the hotel where they were staying and asked for the key to the side door. His valet said, "You shouldn't be out. It's a cold, ugly night, and I fear that you're not feeling well, and it's dark, and please go back with us." And he dismissed himself, walked into the night, and that was the last that anyone ever saw of Louis Clark. The next day, the train station was about 2 blocks from the ocean. The next day, his hat was found floating in the surf in the ocean. His valet identified it as the hat that Mr. Clark was wearing. Of course, the police contacted Winifred in San Francisco. Through the night, she had made it to the St. Francis. The chauffeur reported to the police in Santa Barbara that Louis and Winifred had had a violent quarrel on the way to the train station that night. When Winifred was asked about this, she said, "Everything in our relationship was harmonious, and there is nothing that would savor of a quarrel."
Janelle Burke.
They're very interesting people. Now, how old were they at this point? How old were they when they built the house?
It was completed in 1910. Winifred was about 39, and Louis was about 48.
So they were relatively young at that point. And then what happened after he died to the house? What happened to the house? Did Winifred go back there?
Yes. She waited in Santa Barbara for several weeks, and the police told her there was no hope of her staying there. She hired a private investigator and returned to the Hayden Lake house. She stayed there until 1922, so it was 8 years that she was in the house. She cut the staff, of course. I think there were probably money problems. I think they were quarreling probably about money. We don't know that. I found in the depths of the courthouse in Spokane his will, and I found the probate on his will. She had something like $500,000 in cash, which was $500,000, and lots of stocks, Washington Water Power stock. But what happened to the money over the next 8 years, I don't know. Unfortunately, the house was in the name, it was never in the Clark name, it was in the name of the Hilliard Townsite Corporation. Oh. And the Hilliard Townsite Corporation was lost, and I think the house went down with it, and she probably could not separate it from the Townsite Corporation assets.
Was she managing the estate for the most part at that point?
She was, with the help of her brother-in-law, Arthur Newberry. He was a confidant and advised her. She was how do I say it? Winifred knew how, or Louis knew how to make the money, and Winifred knew how to spend it. And they were both good at what they did.
So, Monty, between the Clarks and your purchase of the house, were there other owners during that period of time?
Not many. The house sat vacant. She left in 22. The house sat vacant until 33. Charles P. Lund, who was the attorney that represented the bank in the foreclosing procedures against her, ended up leasing the house in 1933, and then purchased the entire estate, 1,400 acres, all of the cottages, all of the barns, the writing academy, the pasteurizing plants, everything for the back taxes that were due on the property. Mr. Lund held it until approximately the 50s. Mr. Lafferty and a group went in, sold off the lots. The Honeysuckle Hills subdivision came into place. And from that point on, everything started to be cut up and sold into small portions. A couple of families owned it in the 70s. A family by the name of Ivanoff, a builder here, owned it. He eventually sold it to a big company out of San Francisco who wanted to do what basically I've been able to accomplish. However, at that point there were no sewers, the water system wasn't in. The house had been operating for a while as a restaurant and a small inn, but the health department shut it down because of the old septic tanks and the pollution for the lake and the danger. And so it sat for almost 20 years. It was sold a couple of times during that time frame. The corporation got it back. They looked at it, said it's in such poor repair, we'll burn it down, take the tax write-off, and sell the land for condominiums, which was in process when I bought the property. Fortunately, they had to let the state historic preservation officer know, because someone in '70 had the foresight to put it on the National Register, National Historic Register. And when they told the state historic preservation officer what they were thinking of doing, he pleaded with them. If they were only going to get land value out of it anyway, reduce it to the land value, and some stupid Californian will come along and buy it. And I just showed up on the scene.
Okay. What was that year? That was
1989.
Let's show the video now, and you can talk us through this, Monty.
Sure.
This is a video prior to your purchase, and even by the time you bought it, it's even worse disarray than it is here on the video. But let's show this video. Some people were taking this video, looking at maybe purchasing it too, and if they'll run that at this time, we'll see what a incredible building it is. But it was at this distance you can't tell, but it was, and I'd visited out there. The windows were broken out, and there's all kinds of things missing.
You have to realize there was 150 acres of landscaped grounds here, and the gardens around this house were magnificent, with fountains and colors at all different seasons. Beautiful lawns and putting greens. Mr. Clark actually had on the side lawn a little putting green off his office. And of course the panoramic view of all of Hayden Lake. This is a magnificent wall that was constructed to hold it back, and that was actually the putting green at one time.
This again here is the mansion prior to your purchase, and I understand that a lot of young people go out there and they're partying, and it was almost lost.
Yeah, they actually, by the time I bought it, they were cutting the newel posts and the banisters out, and they were putting fires in the middle of the hardwood floors in the reception room and having kegger parties. The windows were broken. I replaced 1,500 panes of glass just on the downstairs level. The doors were missing. Now, this is a couple of years before I got it. By this time, they brought the chainsaws in and cut the newel posts. The murals that you're looking at in that room, we'll go back to it in a moment. Those murals were by Zuber. They were done in France in the 1840s. That particular suite is in the president's private dining room at the White House. It's called the El Dorado Suite. I can still purchase it. It would cost $150,000 today to redo those murals in that room. Maybe one day we'll get lucky.
But some things did survive in
Yes.
relation to murals.
This is the formal dining room.
And you can see it really is in poor condition.
Yes. But even after that, the marble from the fireplace was all stripped. That dining room will hold 50 people. The grand staircase.
And that was missing when you purchased it.
Yeah, the middle post, the banisters, all the balustrades were gone. There was a big hole there at the landing. They dropped a bathtub from the second floor.
A number of us, before we met you or you came here, we talked about what a tragedy this is going to be. It's going to be lost, and it really came close to being lost. Before I go back to the panel, I also would like to show your website, if they would put up your website for the Clark House Mansion. And when you're here next week, we're going to show what it's like today and what a contribution you've made with this. It's incredibly back to its great beauty, and many people go there, and you're very generous to this community. So the website just comes up on the screen, so those people our viewers can check that for. And you might also just verbally, someone's out of the room, what the website is.
The website is www.clarkhouse.com.
Thank you very much. Janelle Burke.
I want to go back just a little bit to your description of the inspiration of Winifred and Louis by the house in Germany. And then they came back to the United States and decided to build the house at Hayden Lake. Who designed the house, and what was included in the design?
You just heard what happened, or you heard what just happened. A week ago, I've been searching for 15 years to find out who the architect was. And a week ago, in the bowels of a storeroom in Boise at the Parks and Recreation Department, a set of plans was found. The architect, as I have always known, was not Kirtland Cutter. The architect was George C. Wales of Boston, Massachusetts. It was always written that the Boston architect did the house, and now I have the blueprints on the way, so I will be able to confirm that. Forgive me, Janelle, I lost my track.
Well, that's basically what I wanted to know. And then in addition to that, when you're talking about the design, what all was included in that design? Was that just the house, or did it include the grounds as well? And were there more buildings than just the house?
Oh, yes, there were several other buildings on the property. If you came as a guest, you stayed in a cottage with an attendant. There were riding academies, there were barns, pasteurizing plants. The Red Barn was the carriage house. Oh, yes. Yeah, the entire estate.
And what was the transportation to the house?
Of course, they had automobiles, so you could drive in carriages, and of course the trains were coming out to Bazanta Tavern, and then they would send the launch. The captain would drive the launch, sail the launch over to the Bazanta Tavern and pick up guests from there.
And for our friends who don't know what the Bazanta Tavern is, what do we know it by
In today's
today?
world, it's the Hayden Lake Country Club.
Yes, on the shores of Hayden Lake.
That's
yes.
right. That's right.
I have a question. I'm still not clear. Was the mansion the Clarks' primary residence then?
When it was completed in 1910, no. Undercliff Mansion in Spokane was still the primary residence. This was to be their summer home. My research proved that they sold Undercliff Mansion in December of 1910. They built another small home up by the duck pond on Shoshone as their townhouse. And because they were wintering in Southern California, Cutter had been hired to design a new home for them in Santa Barbara. That home was never completed.
And were there any children?
One son, graduated from Harvard, stayed on the East Coast, had two children, and with the help of I spent a week at Washington, D.C., and then went to Harvard, and with the help of Harvard, I was able to find the grandson. He was my guest here a few years ago. Knew nothing, but very, very little about his grandfather, his grandfather's wealth. He was only 17 when his grandmother died, and doesn't remember very much about his father. Didn't talk about it. His father passed away shortly after that. So the grandchildren remember very, very little. I did have one interview with the granddaughter, and by the time I got back to visit her the second time, I was returning some photographs to her. She became ill and passed away very quickly, and so I only got to meet with her once.
Now that we have it to that point, you did purchase it, and you spent a lot of time on this beautiful, beautiful home. I have to say that I think it's the most beautiful home in our whole region. Share some of the statistics with us. How long did the construction last, and what are many of the things that you had to do? You mentioned a minute ago how much glass had to be replaced.
Oh, Lord, Tony.
Did you use an architect?
No, we did for the facade. We did a pergola at the front of the house, and we did do that because we had to run that through the historic preservation people to make sure that we were staying in character with the house. Other than that, we've taken photographs and tried to restore it exactly back to what it was. That's so important in historic preservation. Beautiful marble imported from Italy had all been torn from the fireplaces, and we were not able to replace that. The colors you couldn't even match today. Hardwood floors, the tiger oak hardwood floors, had to be cut out in places because the snow had gotten into the interior of the house and the floors had rotted through. Obviously the staircase and the banisters, an entire new electric system, entire new heating system, all new plumbing, drain systems. So the house had to just practically be done from scratch, which is harder than starting with a new house because you've got to tear into walls and then put it back and keep it historically correct. Bathrooms all had to be modernized. We have about 16 bathrooms in the house now. As you know, we're operating it as a 10-room bed and breakfast and a restaurant and lounge and corporate retreat center, a wedding center.
I heard a story, and not from you, from someone else, and I hope that I'm correct on that when you started the reconstruction or the bringing the house back to its normal condition, that the banister was missing, and that one day or one night it appeared on the front porch of the house, or it appeared that someone. I heard that story. Is that true?
That's close. That's close. A neighbor across the street approached me and said that a friend of theirs had found the banister, or the newel post, lying on the front of the house on the lawn, and had picked it up and put it in his truck and taken it home, and he was too embarrassed to bring it back. And the neighbor said, "Well, I'll take it back to Monty. Give it to me." So one day Jim's truck drove up, and Jim came carrying this thing all wrapped in nice plastic at this point and presented me with this wonderful newel post, which we were able to put back into place.
The reason that story is so significant is I think it shows the pride that people here have, and the happiness they had in having it restored. And here someone is saying, now that you are going to preserve it, that you should have back something that maybe they were protecting it until that time. Anyway, I just think it is a really wonderful story. We're just about out of time. You did indicate before the total footage of the house, and again, you have different rooms with fireplaces and dining areas, and also bedrooms for people to stay.
Yes, we do. Every room on the downstairs level of the house has a fireplace, and every room has at least one door. Some rooms have 3 doors to the exterior of the house, but every room on the downstairs level. 4 of the bedrooms upstairs also have fireplaces. So it was built with care and thought and for the future.
And it's surrounded by beautiful trees and great
Gorgeous
landscape
views.
yard, and the lakes right nearby.
Yep.
And it's very peaceful there. I can testify to that.
Thank
Well,
you.
on that note, Monty, we bring today's program to conclusion, but the great news is that you'll be back next week, and on that program we have video for our guests to let them see what it's like today. And we also did this taping at the time of the holiday, and there's a lot of great decorations. And so, ladies and gentlemen, we'd like to invite you to be with us again next week, when we're going to continue to show you this wonderful, wonderful Clark House mansion, and so you can enjoy, if you've never been there, what Monty Daner has been able to do with it, and to restore it, that you could visit sometime in the future. Until next week, please have a good week. I am Tony Stewart.
Recorded on the campus of North Idaho College, Public Forum is the longest-running in-house college production on PBS. Each episode is pre-recorded live and is an educational outreach from North Idaho College. Please join us at this same time next week for another edition of Public Forum on this public television station.